Okay, so welcome to the socialist isolation class. And we had we had here in Detroit a number of comrades raised that they've been hearing this term or seeing people who calling other people social fascists. And there was a request or a suggestion that we have a class to discuss this. Now, in the heat of a protest or observing a police brutality or something, we've all used the term fascist or screamed at the cops, fascist pigs, and that's loose terminology. But what we want to now go into is talk a lot about the history of this ideology of social fascism. That is calling social democrats or moderate socialists, those who have not achieved the ideology of communism, fascists, and where that came from and where it ended up. So this is more of a presentation. I know some of us are used to classes where we do readings and then discussion. And while I like that, this didn't lend itself to it because it was really condensed from 2 or 3 books. And so I'll begin. So revolutions against oppressive conditions have taken place throughout recorded history. And revolutions that have challenged economic foundations of society are rarer, and revolutions that have succeeded are still rarer. Individuals who place themselves at the service of a developing revolution, and those in the modern era who use the science of Marxism to guide them, are an important component of the revolutionary process. The Great Russian Revolution of 1917 showed that it is critical for revolutionaries to forge a strong revolutionary party for a successful socialist revolution. But unless the revolutionary individual and the revolutionary party have learned important skills and lessons from experience and from history, tumultuous revolutionary periods can be derailed and the prospects ruined, putting off the chances of a successful revolution or even decades. Just having a party isn't enough. Of course, any individual or party can make mistakes, and how quickly they correct such mistakes is important. We can see even today that incorrect theory and misinterpretation of events can be ruinous. Look at some of the groups on the so-called left who denounce Cuba, China, or other socialist countries, and because of their own false ideas of how revolutions should take place. We need to bring together the best fighters for social justice into an organization that also has learned the most important lessons from the past. What made some revolutions succeed, but just as importantly, what caused the loss of the revolution in other situations. That's why we need to discuss and understand the dangerous theory of social fascism. We will have to go back and examine its history. But remember, we're doing this because there are proponents of this theory today. It wasn't even a year ago that we had a struggle against some youth who demanded we focus our energy attacking Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, and who demanded that we label Bernie Sanders a fascist. More importantly, revolutionaries today need to have a strategy on how to win over the large masses of people, especially young people who may be just coming over to a moderate socialist position as a transition step. The application of the theory of social fascism in the communist movement took place in Germany from 1928 to 33. But ideas don't arise from thin air. To understand the German experience, let's take one step back and look at the revolutionary situation that arose in China from 1925 to 1927. In fact, the theory of social fascism, I believe we can state and show, arose specifically from the defeat of the Chinese Revolution of 1925 to 1927, which did not use that, but was a different theory. We should remember that the Chinese bourgeois revolution overthrew the Manchu dynasty in 1911. The Kuomintang, or KMT, which was the Chinese Nationalist Party, was founded by the Venerable Sun Yat-sen in China. In 1922, the KMT affiliated with the Communist or Third International, sometimes called Comintern. Advisors and military aid were sent to the KMT government in southern China by the Soviet Union. In 1925, Chiang Kai-shek became the leader of the KMT after Sun Yat-sen died. From 1925 to 27, there arose mass revolutionary upsurges in cities and villages of the workers and peasants who were often armed. For example, on May Day 1924, over 100,000 workers marched in Shanghai and 200,000 marched in Canton, later was named Guangzhou. In 1925 May, strikes in Japanese-owned cotton mills of Shanghai turned into a general strike. The Communist Party of China, the CCP, grew quickly to tens of thousands of members. It had great influence over the emerging trade unions of millions of workers and also the peasant associations. The masses were aware of the successes of the Bolshevik Revolution to the workers and peasants and paid a lot of attention to that. It's also important to understand that the political direction of the communist parties, China included, came from the Communist International and its executive board in Moscow. The leadership of any party at that time had to follow direction of the Comintern and the ECCI, Executive Committee of the Communist International, or its representatives on site in that country. Or if they didn't follow instructions, they could be and were immediately replaced. And the other thing to note in China, which was important, there was no serious social democratic movement, that is moderate reformist socialist leadership, which gave the Communist Party almost total access to the revolutionary mass movements. The KMT was in power in southern China and set up a government in Canton. In northern China, the areas were controlled by sort of feudal warlords. There were military dictators in various districts who were in alliance with the big landlords and with Western imperialist nations. So the KMT began building an army, mostly of peasants in the rank and file, and set the goal of defeating the northern warlord government based in Beijing. This was called the Northern Expedition, and it's aimed to unify all of gigantic China. So the southern government was led by the KMT, the north was by the warlords, and the KMT announced plans to march north and unify the country. This was part of the basis why the Comintern called it a national liberation movement and gave it a lot of credit and support. The Communist International line was for the CCP members to join the KMT en masse. All Communist Party members were to join. It's also important to note that KMT had no mass organizational base. They had members, but they didn't have locals that controlled regions, which might control a national office or something like that. But it was, the KMT was led by a central committee that predominantly was made up of big bourgeois elements, generals, and landlord elements. The Communist International position, and this is critical to understand what happened in this revolutionary upsurge of 1925 to 1927, called for there to be a bloc of four classes. You might call it a united front, but it was called a bloc of four classes. It was the bourgeois, and this was making up the bourgeois nationalist revolution. The bourgeoisie, the workers, the peasants, and the landlords. So they were all in one bloc. To maintain this bloc and not alienate the bourgeoisie and the landowners, the CCP, under the Communist International direction, agreed to a number of things. One, no criticism of the KMT. So they're in a bloc or a coalition or a united front, but you can't criticize the other elements, including other class elements. They also, the CCP, Communist Party of China, agreed to prohibit strikes, where workers were in the streets in the hundreds of thousands. And they replaced it with compulsory arbitration, but this was often in the hands of bourgeois elements. 3, the Communist Party condemned peasant seizures of land. They said they were doing that, and this is under the direction of the Communist International in Moscow, the majority of the Communist International. The peasants should not seize any of the land, which they were doing left and right. And they were told you have to wait until the final military victory of the Northern Expedition, which would unify the country. So their class struggle was going to be put on hold and under the Communist Party direction until the bourgeois revolution was finished, so to speak. It also prohibited agitation for the formation of worker, peasant, and soldier Soviets or councils, which could become organs of class rule of the oppressed peoples. The Communist International also at this time built up Chiang Kai-shek as a great revolutionary nationalist leader. And he was hosted in Moscow by Stalin and the executive committee on several occasions. And sixth, there was no daily newspaper for the Communist Party of China, which had 100,000, 200,000 members by now. These policies and directions were opposed by Leon Trotsky, Zinoviev, and the left opposition inside the Soviet Union, Communist Party, and in the Communist International. This was the first time the writings and documents of the opposition were restricted and suppressed in the Communist International. Up till then, they had been circulated, discussed. Now they started to be repressed and suppressed. The start of expulsions, mass expulsions of opposition members from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union began. As conditions in China more and more exposed the failure of these policies approved and directed by the Communist International, they found it necessary even to suppress documents of Stalin, Bukharin, and the executive committee leadership as a whole as being too embarrassing. On March 20th, 1926, mass movements surging in the countryside and cities. Chiang Kai-shek carried out a coup in Canton. Massacres of communists occurred, and the mass movements were crushed in this huge city. On December 1926, the end of that year, the left-leaning KMT, because it was a coalition of left, right, and center, the left-leaning majority of the KMT pulled out of Canton and moved its headquarters to Wuhan. That's the same Wuhan of today, the virus fame, and set up a left KMT government in alliance with the Communist Party of China. December 1926, the leader of the CCP, speaking to the 7th plenum of the Communist International Executive Committee, and this guy had been Minister of Agriculture in the KMT government previously, and had actually personally led troops to put down peasant uprisings. And he stated to the Executive Committee of the Communist International, "We sacrificed the interests of the workers and peasants in practice to preserve the bloc of 4 classes." And the Communist International still denied that there was a long-lasting defeat with the massacre that occurred in Canton. But the upsurge was continuing throughout other parts of China. In January of 27, the CCP in Wuhan, still called left KMT, the Communist Party still called the left KMT revolutionary leaders, even though they were in an uneasy alliance with this somewhat progressive left KMT. The line was still, at this time, to suppress to oppose peasant confiscation, of large estates until the military situation in the north improved. And the Communist Party, under the International's orders, opposed the formation of Soviets. And they did that to avoid antagonizing the bourgeoisie and landlord block of class groups that were in the block of four classes. And yet, if you think about it, Chiang Kai-shek had an army made up of what? Peasants. That's who were mainly in these giant armies that were being forged. And how could you undermine the Chiang Kai-shek and his generals' control over peasants if you yourself appealing to the peasants, but then are suppressing their parents and grandparents who are seizing the land? In December of 1926, the plenum of the Central Committee of the Chinese Party stated, "It is unusually difficult for us to decide our tactics in relation to the middle and petty bourgeoisie, since the strikes of non-industrial and office workers are only conflicts within petty bourgeoisie themselves, and both sides, workers and employers, being necessary for the national united front, we can support none of the two sides. Neither can we be neutral." So you can see they had no idea how to proceed, and there was no way to proceed under this policies that they were following. February 1927, Shanghai general strike, 350,000 workers. Street fighting between strikers and the police and KMT troops. But it was not supported by the Communist Party of China in Shanghai, and the strike petered out. On March 21st, about a month later, another general strike of over 500,000 workers actually took control of Shanghai. The Communist International and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union press concluded at this time, March of 1927, that more workers and peasants should join the KMT and strengthen the KMT army. But do not, and this is a quote, "do not carry on any independent work inside the army." Chiang Kai-shek made the Communist Party illegal in most of the territories that he took control of. And on April 5th, Stalin answered Trotsky's warnings about this disaster developing. He said, "Chiang Kai-shek is submitting to discipline. The KMT is a bloc, a sort of revolutionary parliament. When the right is of no more use to us, we will drive it away. At present, we need it. We need the right. It has capable people who will still direct the army and lead it against the imperialists." However, that wasn't going to happen. Chiang Kai-shek can do no otherwise. This is Stalin continuing. Chiang Kai-shek cannot do otherwise than lead it against the imperialists. This speech also was suppressed from the archives. The Communist Party of China statement said, "The question of socialism will not only not be raised at the present time, but will not come up in the near future." The question of socialism will not come up during general strikes. Chiang Kai-shek's army marched on Shanghai at this time in April. It was a stronghold of worker and Communist Party power. On April 11th, 1927, the workers were in control of Shanghai. The Division 1 commander, the military commander of the KMT army, and the division is estimated between 10 and 20,000 troops. So the division commander warned the CCP that a military overthrow is in preparation and that he was ready to stay and defend Shanghai and the workers against Chiang Kai-shek's order. He would stay in the city. The Communist Party Central Committee ordered him and his troops to leave, not wanting to prematurely provoke the bourgeoisie, as the right-wing troops are on the doorstep of the city. The very next day, massacres of workers and communists began in Shanghai. Over the next year, it's estimated that 200,000 communist workers were executed. Even after this, Lasovsky, who was this Communist International representative in Wuhan, which was, as you remember, a left KMT Communist Party city at the time, he was head of the Red International Labor Unions, and he addressed the Trade Union Congress delegates at that time in Wuhan, urging them to call a march declaring loyalty to the KMT as they're massacring people in Shanghai. At the height of this revolutionary wave, it's estimated the trade unions had 2.8 million workers in China. And just as a note, after the defeat of this 1925-27 revolutionary period, it went from 2.8 million down to 60,000. However, around the world, communist parties were being told by the International, because they didn't have communications like we have today, so they get their word from the International, that Chiang Kai-shek's taking of this Shanghai was a great victory. And they celebrated in press releases and mass meetings around the world. However, the Wuhan left KMT, as could have been predicted, turned against the CCP, Communist Party of China, and crushed them. On August 7th, 1927, the Executive Committee of the Communist International swung away from what we can describe as this right-wing two-year trend to an ultra-left trend, an left adventurism, and it ordered the CCP in Canton and other cities to stage armed uprisings to try to seize power. Well, these were destined to fail after 2 years of misleadership and massacres of communists going on throughout southern China, and they were all easily crushed by Chiang Kai-shek's forces. This was the beginning of the application of left adventurism, ultra-left policies that were theoretically laid out at the 6th World Congress of the Communist International in July of 1928. This was called the Third Period. The first period was a revolutionary upsurge led first by the Bolshevik Revolution and other upsurges after World War I. The second period supposedly was of capitalist stabilization in the 1920s. And the third period, which is declared now in middle of 1928, third period was capitalism, coming collapse, and there's no need for alliances, united fronts, or coalitions. Although there was no sign in mid-1928 of the collapse that would come about a little over a year later. I might note here when we finishing up with China that you might say to yourself, but the Chinese Revolution won. Yes, in 1949 it did, by Mao Zedong and the CCP, Communist Party of China. But Mao, after the massacre and destruction of the Communist Party by the hundreds of thousands in the cities and among the workers, withdrew to the countrysides and built a movement among the peasants with a Communist Party at its base. And while officially Mao Zedong declared loyalty to the Communist International, even to the bloc of four classes, and had Communist International representatives traveling with him through China throughout the next decade or more, it's important to note that Mao Zedong ignored all of the directions of these folks and carried out the policies that led to the victory with his own line. Let's look at Germany. The term social fascism was not exclusively used from 1928 to 33. Social fascism was used earlier. However, it got its theoretical justification and became the official policies of the Communist International only in 1928, and was imposed on all communist parties around the world, required to follow their direction. Okay. As early as 1923, the Executive Committee of the International described the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which is the SPD, Socialist Party of Deutschland. They described it as fascist. The tactic of united fronts had been a fundamental tactic of the Communist International and was explained by Lenin in his famous left-wing communism and infantile disorder, this was dropped in favor of the united front from below. What that means is you don't talk to the leaders of the Socialist Party or other groups. You just invite their members to join you, which is no united front, obviously, at all. Many German trade unionists were instructed to leave the SPD-dominated trade unions. The German Communist Party, will use its abbreviation KPD, adopted this in a resolution at their 9th Congress. Quote, the SPD literally went over to fascism. Social democracy has been so thoroughly exposed that even a temporary cooperation of the KPD with the SPD leaders is out of the question. It is a vital matter for the development of the revolution that this most dangerous counter-revolutionary party be annihilated. This was early in 1923-24. However, this ultra-left policy swung back and forth. Reversing this position, the KPD leaders in December of 1925 forced the Socialist Party and their unions into a united electoral front to campaign against compensation for German nobility who had been expropriated in the 1918 bourgeois revolution. Jointly, in a united front electoral grouping, they chalked up 14.5 million votes, 4 million votes than their combined KPD-SPD got in the December before, a year before election. In 1925-26, the KPD launched a drive to reintegrate the KPD communist workers back into the SPD-led unions. And this was more in line with the original Lenin policy and early communist international policy of entering wherever you can and influencing. And this did lead to some success. In November 1925, the elections of the Mine Workers Union, the KPD took 35% of the local unions, of those local unions across Germany, which is quite substantial. But in 1926, the KPD was still calling the left SPD leaders the main enemy. Elections to the Hamburg City Council gave the SPD and the KPD a big majority in October of 1927. The KPD offered to work with the SPD in a coalition city government, but the SPD leaders refused. A couple of months later, December 1927, the 15th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Stalin arbitrarily announced the end of the period of capitalist stabilization in the West. January 1928 saw the Executive Committee of the International announce a new rise of the revolutionary wave in the West, but no evidence was or could be provided. This was the continuation of the wild swing to the left with adventurous insurrections ordered by the Communist International to the Chinese Party earlier in the previous summer. They had been embarrassed by their right coalition with the bourgeois elements. Now there would be not even a united front. The ECCI ordered the communist parties to split SPD-dominated unions in favor of forming separate red unions. The 6th Congress of the International, which was July-August 1928, drove this line decisively. Over 6,000 Communist Party of Germany members who were described as rightists for opposing this ultra-left turn were expelled from the party, 6,000 members, mostly workers. On May 1st, 1929, a march by the KPD in Berlin, the communists in Berlin, was held in violation of a ban by the SPD who controlled the police chief. The police fired on the demonstration, killed 25 workers, communists, wounded 160 other communists. On June of 1929, the KPD declared the SPD social fascist at the 12th Party Congress. Ernst Thälmann, the KPD leader at that Congress, said, "The active appearance of the this is important, the active appearance of the Nazis, National Socialists, in all parts of Germany are outliers of fascism, not the main problem. The SPD was an especially dangerous form of fascist development, the form of social fascism, which consists in paving the way for fascist dictatorship. This was the last KPD Congress before Hitler took power in 1933. So the Nazis weren't the problem, it was the SPD and especially the left SPD. In February of 1930, the KPD declared, quote, "Fascism is in power in Germany." This is 3 years before Hitler. "Fascism is in power in Germany because the SPD was in the government. It's already here. Social fascism knows that for us, there can be no cooperation with them, only a united front from below." That meant the KPD would allow individual Socialist Party members, workers, to join communist organizations against fascism. In March 1930, the SPD quit the national government rather than reduce unemployment benefits throughout Germany. So they moved a little bit, took a left position. The KPD carried out widespread physical attacks at this time on SPD members. They said, quote, "He who still belongs to the SPD," this is members, not the leaders. "He, the worker, who still belongs to the SPD is rotten and has to go." And quote, "We must ruthlessly purge the ranks of the proletariat in factory and trade union of all the rotten elements." In July of 1930, Stalin, the Executive Committee of International, followed by the Central Committee of the German Communist Party, demanded they vigorously fight against left SPD elements. They had to intensify their attacks on the SPD. Quote, "The sharpest struggle must be conducted against the left SPD as the most dangerous enemy within social fascism." The KPD supported the Communist International, became proponents of even an ultra-nationalist line to compete with the Nazis. In September 1930 elections, the KPD bragged about going from 3.3 to 4.6 million, a sizable 1.3 million increase in their votes. And of course, we know votes are just sort of a rough measure of where you stand with the masses. So they gained 1.3 million. But the Nazi Party had increased their vote by 6 million. And the KPD had predicted the Nazis would decline and fall. However, Talman declared, the head of the KPD, he explained it away, saying, "Don't overestimate the fascist danger. That was Hitler's best day. It's only going to get worse for them." We're at early 1931. The Nazis and other nationalists called for a referendum vote to dissolve the Social Democratic Party Prussian government. They had a majority in what's called the Diet or Parliament of Prussia, the biggest state in Germany. They hoped that this would lead, the Nazis and nationalists would hope that this would lead to new elections and the SPD would fail to get a majority. The KPD supported the Nazi initiative, supported the referendum against the SPD. They covered themselves by calling it a red referendum. Stalin and Molotov directed the Communist International Executive Committee to force this KPD to do this because there was some reluctance. In August, the vote was held and it failed to gain its goal. It's estimated, however, that 37% of the Communist Party of Germany members refused to follow their party's orders to vote for the referendum. So the masses had good sense, but meanwhile they're being trained in their minds not to follow the instructions of their party. In October of 31, a Nazi Nationalist United Front led to pressure from the masses to have a working class united front. The left wing of the SPD actually broke from the SPD. and formed something called the Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. In November of 31, the leader of the SPD offered a united front to the KPD, which was rejected. The KPD offered a red united front, but it first required the defeat of the SPD before they would fight fascists. KPD stated in January of 1932, the united front by the KPD will create the conditions necessary for annihilating the mass influence of the Socialist Party of Germany. June 1932, the KPD set up something called Anti-Fascist Action. We've heard that name being used these days. It was a mass organization, but it ruled that they would exclude any reformist organizations, namely the Social Democratic or any of the other organizations. Even this brought down denunciations from Moscow when the Communist International Executive Committee telegrammed a warning against opportunism arising from United Front tactics and neglecting the struggle against social democracy. The Executive Committee warned that the KPD was overestimating the danger from the Nazis. When Heinz Neumann, one of the KPD leaders, proposed on May 24th, 1932, less than a year before Hitler took power, that the party, the KPD, shift to make the Nazis the main enemy, he was peremptorily removed from leadership. And this action was both confirmed by the KPD Central Committee and the Communist International in August of 1932. The end was near. On January 22nd, 1933, the Nazis marched on the Communist Party headquarters in Working Class Center of Berlin. The KPD leaders told their members ignore the provocation. To counter it, the KPD called for a peaceful counter-demonstration 3 days later. On January 30th, 1933, the KPD finally called upon the SPD and all the union federations to join in a general strike against a Hitler dictatorship, but it was too late. Even the KPD supporters hardly responded. Years of political misdirection and confusion had disarmed the masses politically. On that same day, January 30th, Hitler was appointed chancellor and Goering was Minister of the Interior in charge of all the national police. On February 27th, less than a month later, 1933, under the ruse of the Reichstag fire, Hitler took dictatorial power and the Nazis began to pulverize both the Socialist Party and the Communist Party. Despite these parties having hundreds of thousands of members and many millions of supporters across Germany, the Nazis took over without any of these folks firing a shot. Amazingly, a vote was still held, which had been scheduled for March 5th, and this went ahead, even though the KPD was already outlawed. The Communist Party got 4.8 million votes. As we said, it was still too late. Over 4,000 KPD leaders were arrested by late 1933. Over 130,000 KPD members were dragged off to concentration camps, and an estimated 2,500 were simply murdered in that first year. This dangerous theory of social fascism had destroyed any chance of stopping Hitler and the Nazis. It decimated the working class physically and politically and led directly to the Second World War. The Communist International and Communist parties around the world never wrote an analysis of this crushing defeat. Think of it. If we have a demonstration that's a disaster, don't we write about it? Or if it's a success? But no one in the communist movement ever wrote an analysis of this. The International, unable to continue this same line, this ultra-left social fascist line, took a swing back to the right. It was now to be the era of popular or people's fronts. but not a united front where communists artfully maneuver so that the masses can be won over from moderate social democracy to militant communism. No, it was a front, as had been done in China a few years previously, of uncritical coalitions that taught the masses nothing and would lead to more crushing defeats. As an example, and I can't give all the history in the 1930s, post-1933 Popular Front disasters that took place, let's look quickly at the Spanish Civil War and then we'll end and start a discussion. The Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939 provides more evidence that the Comintern, unable to provide revolutionary leadership, had swung again to the right after the disaster and embarrassment of their ultra-left third period line. We can't here recount the dramas and the heroes of the Spanish Civil War, but a few points will make things clear. The Republican side represented the government of the Second Republic of Spain. It was a bourgeois government, but with strong representation of the Communist Party and various anarchist and other left socialist parties. The Popular Front policies proclaimed by the Comintern and adopted by the Spanish Communist Party and others after Hitler's victory went back to the policies of the bloc of classes. The CP would not introduce any demands that might antagonize the bourgeois and large landlords who continued somewhat to lean to the Republican side in the Civil War. Social reform, this is the line of the communists, social reform would have to wait until after the victory of Franco's fascist side. Well, ask yourself, Franco had troops. Where did he get troops from? Most of the workers would not join the fascists. They were quite class conscious in Spain. He recruited them largely from peasantry throughout the country, uneducated peasants, the children of peasants. The other area where he got troops were from Spanish colonies, such as Morocco, which were colonial troops dragged off to Spain to fight for him. Well, how can you dissolve or disintegrate an army made of peasants and drafted African troops? Two things. I'm only touching on two policies that might have been implemented that might have won the Spanish Civil War. One is for the Republic to declare land to the peasants. Every peasant wants land, and in these countries, the big landowners had almost like feudal estates. The peasants had little or no land. If you declare land to the peasants, and in your areas of control, give them to those peasants, won't they hear about that in Franco's army? Won't the peasant, the sons and daughters of peasants in that army switch sides? No doubt they would have. But they wouldn't do that. The Communist Party forbade that. That was against the policy of the Popular Front. And finally, simple, you want to win over the fascist troops that had come from Morocco? What do? I think everyone here knows exactly what you do. You declare independence for the colony of Morocco and all the colonies, and declare that country independent, and that would spread through the troops, and those troops would have no loyalty to the fascists. It would have pulverized that army. Neither of these policies was permitted, although they were raised by certain individuals. But the communists said we couldn't antagonize the bourgeoisie and the landlords. Got to keep them happy. And those are only two examples. This was also occurred in France and many other situations throughout the 1930s. And ultimately, of course, we had the Second World War. So why are we talking about all this old stuff? We're talking about it because not only is this policy or this term social fascism being brought up by some people, but we ourselves are faced with the challenge of winning over a large, moderate social democratic movement, such as the DSA and others. And how could it be otherwise? Young people coming to socialism aren't going to just jump into communist ideology. There's usually a transition. And some of you listening today step in your political development, went through maybe the Bernie Sanders campaign, maybe the McGovern campaign, maybe the McCarthy campaign back in the 60s, but none of us, I don't think, jumped directly, unless you were what we call a red diaper baby, born into a communist family. There's a transition, there's a period. And the art is in knowing of communists, even small parties and organizations, knowing how to build coalitions, raise criticisms, hold your criticisms back when necessary, forming united fronts and breaking united fronts if it's necessary. There's no simple formula you can see, but if you're not a revolutionary who studied this and really has some art to your politics, then all you can do is swing from right to left, left to right, and you can't build and maintain a revolutionary momentum that way. So I want to open it up for discussion. I think, how do you want to do this? Michael, Jane, you want to coordinate who speaks? So not everybody at once?
Sure. Does everyone know how to raise their hand?
It's under something called reactions if you're in the book.
It's under participants.
No, it might be under participants.
Or just
window.
speak up.
Like I just did, yeah, you press on, if you're on computer, you press on participants, and then you see a thing that says raise or lower hand.
Okay, I see a thumbs up, but that's not, is that a raised hand?
That's a reaction. You want to press on
Thumbs
participant.
up is different.
Yeah, participants opens up a window.
Yeah.
To the right.
Thumbs up is different. You can just do that if you like what somebody said or whatever.
Or just speak up.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Whoever wants to speak.
Austin, can you hear me?
Go for it. Yep.
Oh, yeah, I had a question in terms of the lesson here, I guess, is that we should try to recruit from the Democratic Party.
So the question is, do we want to recruit from the Democratic Party? Well, we want to recruit anybody who's interested in socialism, clearly. And we know that a large number of the youth are interested in socialism, so we should see where we can, but I would say yes to any place you want to go. If there's a DSA, I know some of our comrades here who are on here have gone to DSA meetings and we've raised ideas, but we don't go to praise their participation in the Democratic Party. We're going there to invite them to things, invite them to something around Cuba, to support Venezuela, to try to move them to the left. So your answer to your question, Austin, is yeah, that's sure, we want to recruit, but we're not looking to recruit the Democratic leadership, who we feel are pretty hopeless, but we are interested. It's a million-fold member party, and I'm sure we're going to win a lot of those over before it's over.
We can even win over Republicans. A lot of them go there, or independents go to Trump because they are fed up with the Democrats.
That's true.
Bill,
Go ahead, Bill.
can you hear me?
Yes.
It's not only a matter of recruiting. I mean, we want to recruit people to the revolutionary parties, but it's a matter of moving masses into struggle on large scale. Like, for example, you know, when Sanders calls for a $2,000 a month relief for everybody, while the state is only willing to give $1,200 one time, or when Ilhan Omar calls for canceling rent and mortgage payments. I mean, these are demands that we could make, and which the ruling class at this stage of its development, at this stage of capitalist crisis, is not willing to accept, which means that even the majority of Democratic senators and Congress will not support that. So that lays the basis for getting people involved in struggle, a mass struggle, even particularly focusing on the Trump regime. So if every time Sanders says give people 2,000 a month and raise the minimum wage, or Ilhan calls for canceling rent and mortgage payments, not canceling, not postponing. And we just said, oh, they're just social fascists. They're just trying to mislead you. Where does that get you? You got to go with the masses as far as you can go, and then you break when the potential is there. The CP in the 30s, in 32 they called Roosevelt a fascist, which is ridiculous. In 36 they supported him uncritically, but in 36, by that time the workers were seizing plants, were going on general strikes. It was a step backward to call for supporting a Democratic candidate. But we're not calling for supporting Democratic candidates now, but I mean, it's you can't. The key is how to get to the masses that are enthralled to either the Social Democrats then or the Democrats, which the majority of the Black community is loyal to the Democratic Party. We don't. That's where most of the votes of the Democrats here are Black and Latin and are oppressed people. We don't, we got to win them, not by just saying you're a bunch of fools who are following misleaders who are no different than Trump, who are no better than Trump.
I voted for Sanders in the primary. Is that a good idea?
I'm sorry, can we have a stack? Other people are trying to get on also.
Sorry.
And people who are no longer talking should probably mute, or we're going to get a bunch of noise.
I don't see any hands.
I had my hand on the.
Physically?
Yeah, there are hands.
Sorry.
I mean, the participant hand thing is the thing that works.
All right, well, let's go.
I'll watch that. Yeah, Tova's up, then
Go ahead,
Jason,
Mike.
then Jackson. That's what I see. Okay.
Okay, thanks. And yeah, please remember to mute if you're not talking. So I just wanted to say that, when we talk about where to recruit from, I don't even think that that's a huge issue right now, because there's so many people mobilizing in so many different ways right now, and not only through unfortunately Zoom calls like this one, but people are starting to have car rallies and all kinds of other events. But I think what we have to do is, for example, there's a huge risk we have to look at of Trump possibly trying to cancel or postpone the November elections, and so that's the kind of thing you have to look at when you talk about United Front, and this goes together with all the efforts to suppress the vote, especially the Black vote, the efforts to suppress the vote of poor people, of students, and all of that. So these movements can, and also probably a clue to what Trump is thinking is, he's going out very publicly against vote by mail. And what do you know? The post office is in another crisis and demanding immediate funds to prevent from going under. Well, and Trump's refusing to support the post office. So what would that happen? What would happen to vote by mail in states that even have it if the post office goes under? So it's a very insidious thing that you can't put anything beneath Trump. But all I'm saying is that United Front politics around a lot of these issues with leadership from a leftist perspective, where the Democrats are too afraid to voice any major criticisms and limiting themselves to the meekest of demands, like the whole Biden thing with not even supporting, even now, Medicare for all. Even now, there's no support coming from Biden for Medicare for all. So there's lots of opportunities to intervene and to lead struggles and show the way in this. That's all.
All right, Jason, you're up next.
All right, thanks. I have two things real quick. One would be talking about the concept of I think it was United Front from Below, which is this idea of not reaching out to the leadership, I believe, but reaching out only to the members, which is, I think, a thing that we, like, where does that fall in the range of like tactics, and should we be reaching out to leadership or not of these social democrat groups? And then secondly, how should we orient ourselves towards former Sanders supporters? I mean, because there does seem to be a split, at least in my Facebook feed, of people that are saying, I'm not going to vote for Biden. And then there are sorry, did that all come through? It said my internet connection was unstable at one point. I'm getting ahead. No. All right. Well, somebody else should just go ahead then. Sorry.
Go ahead, Jackson.
We got most of it, Jason.
We hear
I
you
would. I was just gonna say, I think this is the biggest problem with something I remember reading a little bit in A Global Class War in American Destiny was like the biggest problem that I at least personally see with all of this is none of this really happens without the Comintern being able to just do whatever it wanted, basically. And I'm just wondering if David, if you agree with such an analysis that like if the Comintern didn't hold this like motherland of the revolution thing, where the Soviet Union just kind of told whoever what to do, they all had to do whatever it said. If that didn't exist, and we had like independence and coordination, do you think all these things would have happened? If it was true, like the Soviet Union just couldn't tell people what to do, and the KPD had independence, and the Spanish Communist Party and the Chinese Communist Party, if they all had real independence, do you think all these things would have happened or not? If it was a true cooperation, basically, if there was true cooperation rather than this motherland of the revolution thing, do you think all these lines would have even been possible?
You want to answer, David?
I'm taking some notes on the questions, Jason and Jackson's question. I'll answer afterwards.
Okay, Austin, I'm going to
questions.
jump to Sharon first because she hasn't spoken yet. Okay, then we'll go to you. Go ahead, Sharon.
You're muted.
Okay. David, I am so glad that I've talked with you about this before, because I don't know, I'm a little anxious today. There's stuff going on, but it was like alphabet soup. I couldn't follow the whole thing in the beginning. There were all these initials. I tried so hard to concentrate and learn which was one, and then it went into the next alphabet and the next alphabet, and I was totally lost. And for me, then I couldn't take the points that you were making and bring them up to the present, because I couldn't really grasp the whole first part of the talk. So maybe next time you give this talk, you can maybe give a handout of what all the abbreviations mean, and maybe take a little bit more time so people can put it in their heads if they don't have it there already. But I'm so sorry that I couldn't get more out of the talk. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Go ahead, Austin.
Yes, I had a question on participation in November election. The Green Party, does that fit in positively in any way? That's my question.
Okay, anyone else before David answers? Okay, David, there are no more hands up.
Okay, and other people on this call can answer also, but I'll give my reply, and I'm not going to be too extensive on this. So Jason, I did hear some of your question. Uh, should we, I think you were saying, should we reach out to social democratic leaders like DSA leaders?
I posted my question in the chat,
Oh, I got to read.
by the way, but you can just go ahead and answer whatever you heard.
Okay, no, I'm going to read it. Give me a second. Okay, so see, I mean, we're always looking to address ourselves to anybody who will listen, individuals, and the more left they are, that's great. But in terms of leadership, I think, you know, we should not, we don't have to try to get a united front every day in every place. I think what we have to do is look for places where it'll be fruitful. I think we sent someone to, when we held an anti-war demonstration after New Year's, we sent someone to the DSA meeting, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if it was you or someone else went to let people know. So, you know, we don't have to go and have, you know, steak dinner, take them out to wine and dine. We can approach the leadership and the membership at their meetings. If we know individual leaders, we can solicit united fronts. But the idea is that we have access, they'll have access to us. I'm not worried about anybody here falling for DSA ideology, official DSA. And they may worry about us having access to their membership, but that's the whole idea. We can have a united front. If necessary, we can also criticize inside that united front. So I don't know if that exactly answered your question, but you know, those are not exclusive. You know, we invite people to our meetings. We had some DSA people come to our moratorium Macaulay meetings. That's great. And if they stayed, that would be great. But at some point, as Tova's point was well taken, that we need to have or help organize mass movements wherever we are, and whatever group we belong to, and we can do that in a united front spirit. Jackson wanted to know if there was no commentary. Well, I don't know if we can address if, because there was a commentary because there was a Bolshevik revolution and things happened, and we don't have to go through all of it. We went through a little bit today what happened, but it can't all be blamed on the Comintern and the more conservative turn in the Soviet Union, socialism in one country, because Mao succeeded. A group of communists in China succeeded in following a revolutionary line, not the classic in the cities and the trade union line. They followed a revolutionary line and won power and seized power in the biggest country in the world. So, and that was from a very new party. That party had just formed a few years before, had been tiny. So Germany had a lot of folks, but they had left-wing, right? And when they say they were right-wingers in Germany, meaning the party, communists, they're talking about people who thought that united fronts were a good idea. So even Sharon, when you do hear some of this, it's confusing. Even that's confusing because they're expelled as right-wingers for wanting to follow Lenin's prescriptions on staying in the unions and boring from within. But yeah, I don't think it's helpful to, I mean, it's important to know what happened and to study what happened and to learn the lessons. You know, I don't know too many of us who would call for the masses to return. You know, if workers seize the factory today somewhere, we'd rush over there to defend it. I don't know that we'd call for, we need a united front with Biden and we can't antagonize the factory owner. That's exactly what they were doing. So yeah, it can be blamed somewhat on the Comintern and the positions, but also the fact that they were very young communist parties, and you know, in other countries where they were less under the thumb of Comintern, maybe they made more gains. Sharon, I do have this in writing. I'll forward you. Anyone else who wants it, the talk, pretty much most of it. And but I think the thing to focus on is that you maintain your revolutionary policies and independence. And if the masses are moving, we go with them. You don't try to hold them back. Generally speaking, that's true. And then if you're in a coalition and folks do something that's really rotten, your coalition partners, you pull out, you break with them. You know, I remember the Chinese were having diplomacy with the United States. Well, we would support that up to a point. But when the US started bombing Hanoi and Haiphong harbors, the Chinese, I think the Soviet Union, I can't remember the details. One or both of those were maintained Nixon's visit. They should have canceled the visit. It's just ABCs. You show solidarity with those who are fighting in a tense situation. Austin, your question on the Green Party, that's going to have to be discussed a lot. You're talking about the debate whether there's a tax on the Green Party. They shouldn't run against Biden. I don't think we'll take that position, but we'll be discussing that a lot more. We should have a discussion on this lesser evil, because it's since the 1930s, it's hindered the development of an independent working class movement to say, well, we got to go with the Democrats, they're lesser. And that's the Communist Party line up to today. And I don't think we would throw that at the Green Party.
I had one other question that's kind of related. It could actually be four parties, because Mark Cuban, the Maverick owner, billionaire, Shark Tank famous guy, he has recently suggested he wants to run for president. He'll probably go on the Libertarian Party. So he'll take Trump votes away. You got potentially three parties, and the Greens, if they ever make it, maybe a fourth in November.
Well, in general, I think we could say that we're not interested in lesser evil theories. The real problem in this country has been the lack of an independent working class movement. And unfortunately, we don't even have an independent working class party that unites the best of the left yet. But that's what's missing. The elections will come and go. Maybe they won't even come. The question will be how to build a struggle. That's really what's missing. I'll leave it.
Tova's got her hand up next. Go, Tova.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, David. And thanks to everybody for all the different questions and thoughts on this. I wanted to raise a couple more things about different aspects. Like, for example, we talk a lot about the DSA, but there's another grouping called the Working Families Party. I don't know how many of you have heard about them, but they're taking on, I think, some momentum, at least out here. And it's a scary thing. I'm not sure right now what their positions. I haven't looked at it lately since Bernie, threw his support for Biden. But they're kind of in a way, they're replacing the old CP, and I think some of them come from the CP, and they're working within the Democratic Party. But it's hard to see where they're going to go with this. They come from a left point of view, but like way under critical of the bourgeois Democrats and stuff like that. So they're another grouping to watch, and just because they're exerting a lot of influence in the left. And then another grouping are people in the left who have actually, they joined the Democratic Party to support Bernie, for example, and they're still in there, So, definitely we have to watch you can't not reach out to these folks because we want to pull them back from Biden, or at least I think we do at this point. Definitely want to pull them back from Biden. So, and then, and I know there's some differing opinions on this, but out here in California, we have the Peace and Freedom Party. That's the party that Krista was able to run her campaign for state assembly around. But they're looks like Lori LaRiva and Leonard Peltier are going to get the nomination of the Peace and Freedom Party to be on the ballot in California for under the Peace and Freedom Party, but they're running nationally. I don't know how many states they're on the ballot of or whatever, but as far as I know, that's the only socialist party that's going to be on the ballot in a lot of states right now. And, there's considerations in terms of, in California, for example, I don't think there's any fear that Trump's going to get elected. So it's a little easier here to say you're going to vote for a socialist party, for example. But I just wanted to throw out that there's, a lot going on right now, and we really have to keep our eye on this. But, putting pressure right now for people's demands is really key, and to especially against imperialism and sanctions against all these countries that Trump is, throwing sanctions against, and the whole situation in Venezuela where he's actually sent warships, etc. So, there's a lot of room to bring campaigns and keep the left demands front and center.
Jerry, you're up next.
You're muted, Jerry.
I'm unmuted. In any discussion, we have to begin from the perspective of what is our political perspective. We're communists. Our political perspective is that the only answer to the crisis of the workers and oppressed is to overthrow the capitalist system and build a revolutionary socialist new society. That's what we begin with. And that's what our goal is. And in every united front in this whole discussion comes from that goal. How do we win over more and more people to that perspective, which is a distinctly different perspective from social democracy that is rooted in reforming capitalism. Our differences with Bernie weren't just tactical, is that Bernie wasn't for revolution. He was for a political revolution based on reforming capitalism. When you read all the DSA leadership, their ideological view is mostly, most of what they're writing now are polemics against communism. If you just read their international line is against revolutionary socialism, is to deny the existence of the gains of the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc and communism in general, to write off Leninism as a polemic against Leninism. And that's not our view. It's a fundamental difference with our view. Our view is revolutionary, is a communist view. The question is, how do we win over people to our view? And that's really what united front politics to me are all about. When you have millions, thousands, tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of youth orienting towards socialism, and in the first step of that orientation, they orientate toward the more moderate forces, whether it's Sanders or DSA, we have to find our way to them. So the question of united front from below or above, it's not a rigid question. It's that you can't you can't reach people when you're denouncing those who they're following. You have to be tactical in how you do it. And that Trotsky wrote about that constantly, and that's our approach. So one of the reasons we were very critical when we have the youth who wanted to call Rashida Tlaib a bootlicker and Ilhan Omar a fascist. Well, it was ridiculous because what it did is it cut away. These were the most progressive elements within an emerging current, and by doing that, you write off, you isolate yourself from that current as a whole. That's, I think, when the difference is between a united front from below or from. We're always for united front from below, but sometimes you got to be tactical in how you approach the leaders as they exist, especially when those leaders are from the oppressed community. But I do think that's what's fundamental in our view. We want to find a way to people to win them over to revolutionary politics. We have no interest in a united front with the Democratic Party. The Democratic is a bourgeois party, and to the extent that we would support Sanders at any point or factors in it, it was to break that party apart, to break the working class and oppressed layers from the bourgeois layers at the top of it. We have no alliance. There's no united front with the Democratic Party. They are a party of the bourgeoisie, have always been, and our orientation, where we took a tactical orientation during the Sanders campaign or the Jackson campaign years ago, it was with the orientation, not finding our way to work with them, but finding a way to break them apart and to win over the elements away from them. My view is one of our important opportunities now is that these layers that are leaving, that were treated in such a rotten way by the system for support, who supported Sanders, who had an illusion that Sanders was going to do anything, an illusion that somehow capitalism was open to reform, they learned a harsh lesson. And they learned it harshly and quickly. And a lot of them are pissed off and frustrated and looking for an alternative. To me, the most important task we have now is to reach them with revolutionary ideology. That's what I think is our most important task right now, because a lot of them are looking to move to the left. And we want to find the best of their elements right now that are looking. I understand 1,000 people have signed up to join PSL in the last couple weeks. Why? Because they're looking for a communist organization. And to me, if we want to talk about a united front, one of the united fronts we really need to think about is the united front of the communist movement to broaden our influence to reach these people. To me, in the election, I see no value in supporting the Greens, because the Greens are really nothing but a social democratic party. And we've seen them over and over again. They have no interest of breaking out of a very limited political approach. They've had that opportunity in the past, but you can see by even who they're running now. They're running an old white man that's not really where they're looking. And I see no value. On the other hand, if we could find a way to supporting a communist campaign in this election, I see a lot of value to that. But I just want to end with that. I think we want to be clear on what we are communists. We're not looking to compromise our view. We're looking to win over the people to our view, to break out of isolation. And I think right now we have a very good opportunity because of what Sanders did. He made it easier for us in a way because he treated his own grouping so rudely. I didn't see a vote. I put on some of the biggest Sanders supporters. Well, gee, it was supposed to be a social movement. Did the movement vote on whether they were going to support, Sanders was going to support Biden? I don't think so. It showed how cynical he was about his own movement. And I think we can reach people. I think people are angry, they're pissed, they're frustrated, and we got to go aggressively with a revolutionary ideology. I think that's our main task in this period, to go to them with a revolutionary ideology, to find the best of them. And I think there are a lot of them that are looking to move to the left, who learned a harsh lesson. Let's take advantage of it and win them to the communist perspective, which is the only perspective that can move forward.
Okay, next up is Bill, but before we do that, David, I want to draw your attention to a comment by Tom, and maybe you could address it at some point. It's in the chat window. All right, go ahead, Bill.
You're muted.
Can't hear you, Bill.
Yeah, you're unmuted now, but we still can't hear you.
Maybe try typing.
Not muted by the administrator, is he?
No, he's unmuted here.
Are you using your computer mic, or what mic are you using? It sounds like your mic's not working.
Use chat down in the middle bottom.
You may not be watching that.
I can address,
Tova, can you, but Bill, can you hear us? Hello? All right, you're muted. We can't hear you. We don't know what's going on.
But you can type your question into the chat, or your comment. It doesn't have to be a question, but we just can't hear you until you're. Why don't we go on until he can fix his sound?
I can address Tom's question or comment.
Okay, go ahead.
So if you haven't seen it, Tom pointed out that the Socialist Party of Germany was a very powerful party from the top of the very government, state governments, local governments, police forces, trade unions, etc., and that perhaps it's not equivalent to talk about DSA, which is not similar to that. I don't think that we're talking just about DSA, although it's a large formation of young preliminary socialists, you might say. But also the trade unions are tied to the Democratic Party. They are labor formations, but often headed by labor lieutenants of the capitalist class, as someone said 150 years ago. And I don't think we would turn our backs on trying to penetrate. We had some experience in our day of working within the unions and carrying out maneuvers inside unions, even trying to take leadership in some of the local unions. So I think there's a general truth. Yes, the SPD was huge, powerful, and influential, but I don't think it changes the general approach to the emerging socialist movement, which is very different in this country, but still it's going to have to go through various stages, and we need to have an approach to it.
Okay, Austin's next, and then after that, Chris.
Okay, my next question is, or final one, is related to once before some of you communists ran on the Green Party with some degree of success and usefulness in propagating the ideas that are desired. I'm wondering if that might be useful this year, since we don't really have a very, Howie Hawkins isn't bad, but he certainly could be overcome in the Green Party nomination process here in Detroit, coming up by Workers' World or Communist League or whoever. It certainly is very open because our past nominees, Joe Stein, have dropped out. Any thought to anybody doing that sort of thing, or no? They're on the ballot. That's the they're not against communism.
Well, I could just address it briefly. We haven't been discussing it. As some people know, we utilize the Green Party in an alliance, sort of a united electoral alliance, and utilize it to get around the state. It was not a presidential election, which meant that we weren't tied to a national campaign. I don't think it's absolutely outside the realm of possibility, but we have not been looking at that at this point. It might be worth discussing amongst ourselves.
Okay, Chris, you're next up.
Comrades, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to say, first of all, with the current coronavirus crisis, that it's, we are encountering a lot of obstacles in terms of organizing. I mean, we can't even meet and so on. And this is and thank you so much for presenting this opportunity to do the digital meeting. I just wanted to say that the coronavirus crisis does present an opportunity for us to distinguish ourselves from the Social Democrats in that, in addition to their correct demands for for all the workers and oppressed to receive the benefits that they have from their labor, to continue to receive that from the wealth that they've accumulated and given to, and it was taken from them and given to the bourgeoisie, that we can distinguish ourselves by showing the catastrophic in our propaganda, the catastrophic mishandling of the economy by the bourgeoisie. They are incapable, and that includes the Trumpists as well as the Democrats. And so I'm using that as an interlude to invite friends and comrades to submit articles to our Fighting Words organ, so we can review them and post them, and along the lines of what they're thinking. I'm done.
Thanks, Chris. Chris is the editor of Fighting Words. You can get it online at fighting-words.net. Next is Jason.
Okay. If I cut out, I put my question in the text. I'm asking, I'm wondering about this whole concept of social fascism as this sort of strategic question of whether to do a united front with whom and in what way, versus the sort of the rhetoric aspect of it, which is literally using the word fascist at somebody as we are trying to create some sort of united front with them or try to win them over, and what people's thoughts on that are. Did that go through?
Yes, it did. I heard it. Want to answer, David?
Yeah, well, of course, there's a rhetorical component to it, but let's remember that the Communist Party was physically leaving the trade unions, the mass trade unions, under this third period ideology. So they were withdrawing, forming their own isolated unions, usually small isolated unions. They were physically attacking individual workers and supporting and campaigning for a Nazi-initiated referendum. Calling it a red referendum, but didn't change the fact that people knew it was a Nazi-sponsored attack on the SPD, Socialist Party. So it wasn't just rhetorical, it encompassed positions and organizing tactics, etc. It's not the first time. In the early 70s, we went to the aid of the Socialist Workers' Party, who came under attack by a group that I can't remember the campaign, but it was a campaign to destroy physically. And we physically fought outside defended meetings of the SWP, along with SWPers, against these folks who were supposedly left-wing, and they were going to annihilate, physically beat up and destroy the Socialist Workers' Party. And they attacked our office once also, but a minor way. So, yeah, it leads to more than just a little rhetorical excess. I mean, you can see if the Socialist Party in Germany shot down workers, dozens of workers, hundreds of workers, you can see the anger and you can understand that you want to destroy these people. But the question is, how do you win over the mass of their membership? How do you expose this to them? It isn't they wrote these resolutions. Everyone can see it. Well, not everyone could see it. And you had to find ways to them. That's all.
Okay, Bill, I see you have your hand up. I don't know if we can hear you yet.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, very good.
Yay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was dealing with the microphone on my laptop rather than the microphone setting on Zoom. Sorry, just inexperience. Okay, so here's my comment and question. It raises a bit of a contradiction, and this is not to give any foundation to the false line of social fascism, just to note that to fight it, we have to deal with its experiential basis. The influence of the suppression of the early Chinese revolution was gone into in depth, but what are we to make of the influence of the suppression of the German Revolution, or the waves of revolutionary upsurge from 1918 to 1923? This was actually by a social democratic government directly enlisting the Freikorps, the paramilitaries that directly inspired the Nazis' brown shirts only a few years later. This actual social democratic collaboration with the fascist militias, drowned the early communists in blood and killed its leaders in Berlin and Bavaria. Just a decade in their own past, it strikes me that this was a much more visceral reason for the errors of the KPD a few years later. Plus, after the Reichstag fire, the social democratic delegation that remained deliberately abstained in the votes to suppress the KPD in hopes that the Social Democrats would be spared, which was, of course, in vain. This didn't just happen in Germany. In Finland, it was exactly the same way. The SPD did the same while their fascist Lapua party, together with the Finnish police, physically attacked the Finnish communists and banned their party. So if we're to fight this false line of social fascism, how do we confront and politically deal with the actual betrayals of social democrats that gave rise to this historic error in the communist movement? And moving from this history to our current situation, what are our best arguments and actions with regard to today's social democrats, both in and out of the Democratic Party? And by the way, I would very much like to agree with what Comrade Jerry just contributed as I was formatting my difficulty here with the microphone. But I'm also eager for more perspectives. And I'm sorry that I missed much of the recent talk about the current pandemic situation, which is obviously critical now. So that's my comment and question. I'm all ears.
Go ahead, David.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Bill. That was excellent questions. And I can't try to deal with all of them, but I was tempted to deal because I arbitrarily started with China just to maintain some decent length of time for this talk.
Mm-hmm.
But I very much wanted to start with Germany 1923. And that actually was not due to the Comintern position. It was due to the inexperience and weaknesses of the German party. Mm-hmm. And that was Trotsky wrote, it was a real opportunity for a revolution, and they put it off and failed to carry it out. So that was a defeat. And as you said, there had been other defeats before, but that was a real critical defeat where perhaps they could have seized power. And it wasn't the International's fault at that point, or pushing the line. But the defeat of that revolutionary situation in Germany, 1923, really laid the basis for a conservative feeling among a lot of the Soviet party that some people, including Trotsky, felt led to the triumph of the bureaucratic wing, the socialism in one country, which really reflected a feeling that communism, the workers in the West and other countries, communists overseas, weren't going to win, and the best we could do is just try to win a few friends from some liberal governments. So there was the defeat of Germany led in many ways to the conservative. You could talk also about the British Communist Party not breaking with the trade union leaders there during the general strike, and which weakened them terribly under the influence of the Soviet Union, telling them, no, don't break with these social democratic Labor Party leaders. So it was, yeah, the German party defeat was very much a conservatizing influence in Soviet Union and the Comintern, and that led to the block of four classes, lack of confidence in the masses in China. I know you asked a lot of other questions, but I think that was the key that had been on my mind. But it just was too much to go through the whole development of the Comintern 1919 through 23, and then after that, what we talked about.
Okay, next up is Sharon.
Well, I'm sorry. You did. Yes, these people were butchers. There's no question. They killed Luxemburg, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, murdered the two greatest communists in Germany. They slaughtered workers. They jailed people. They outlawed the Communist Party for a while. It's not a moral thing not to, and you condemn them. We can condemn people when we break with them. On the other hand, there were periods where we needed to approach a united front where we didn't allow that anger, that frustration, justifiable anger to isolate ourselves or themselves from the broad masses of people. So I guess we've said that before, but that's it again.
All right, Sharon, go.
Well, my comments are in response to what Jerry said. I'm wondering if Socialist Workers Party, if Workers World got any new people signing up, or Struggle La Lucha got any new people signing up. And what is it about PSL that drew so many people? And what could we do as a revolutionary party to attract people to us at this moment? What are some concrete things we can do? That's it.
Well, do we want, that was directed to Jerry, right?
Yeah, but anybody else can answer it.
Okay, there's a number of hands up, so I'll just go through the stack. Next up is Tova. Go ahead, Tova.
Okay, well, I'll speak to Sharon's point first. And I have no information about Workers' World or Struggle La Lucha, although we have Bill on the call here from Struggle La Lucha, so he might be able to speak up about that. But as far as Workers' World, the one thing I do know is they've taken to a lot of Zoom forums all of a sudden, and I don't know if that's gotten them any new recruits or not. But as far as PSL goes, they're on the ballot. They're very visible in a whole bunch of states, and they started out pretty large in the first place before going into the election season. And so when people who were participating in the electoral process through supporting Bernie Sanders, the ones who were angered and felt deserted when Bernie went and threw his support, or pulled from the campaign and then threw his support behind the imperialist Biden, then they were an obvious place to go for those people, is to another party that's on the ballot. I don't know how many states are on the ballot, but I know they're on the ballot in California, the most populous state in the country, and they are on the ballot in a number of other places as well. As far as how we can recruit, I wish I had some good answers on that, because it's a combination of our positions, as Jerry pointed out, but it's also part of our ability to put those out in terms of demands and concrete actions. And as small as we are, we're kind of limited in some of the things we can do. So I'm going to leave that answer at that. I did want to raise, related to Bill's question about social fascism and the people who were massacred, etc. Just a current example, and it didn't lead to massacres, but when in the last few years, when there's been all these demonstrations against current fascists in the U.S., the liberal left or social democratic left or whatever, some of them supported, were more angry at the anarchists for fighting the fascists than they were at the fascists, you know. So you can kind of see the divisions there. Some of them were in support of the fascists, who were, I mean, not the fascists, the anti-fascists, who were a large part, the Antifa were a large part anarchists. And there were smaller numbers of socialist groups that were part of that anti-fascist movement. There, we participated, and I think everyone here participated in some kind of way against, you know, fascist movements in the last couple of years when they happened. But so, you know, that there's a division there that you can see between those so-called left-leaning folks who took a harder stand against the anarchists and the Antifa than they did against the frickin' fascists. So just another thing to look at there, that's all.
Hi, Bill, you're up next.
You know, it's interesting, of course, when the Social Democrats murdered Rosa and Carl, they had to use fascists to do it. When the Social Democrats or liberal or Democratic mayors call out the cops on you, the cops are fascists. They're politically fascist, and they all vote for Trump, or for the most part do, at least the white ones do. But so, I mean, social democracy and fascism are both enemies. But just like you got to fight them in different ways. Just like, you know, if you're attacked by tanks, you use anti-tank weapons. If you're attacked by infantry, you use, you know, rifles. Or, you know, you need different tactics against them, how to defeat them. And they're different because their bases are different. You know, the Republicans that are here, the Trump gang, the fascists generally historically mobilize people on the basis of racism and bigotry and misogyny and anti-Semitism. And anti-gay, trans. I mean, that's how they mobilize people on that basis. The Democrats mobilize people on the basis of they claim to be for the working class. They claim to be for civil rights. They claim to be for unions and against racism and against mass deportations. Even if they do it, they win people. In order to preserve their validity, they have to take that position. Their value to the ruling class is that they appeal to the progressive and oppressed masses. So how do we break the progressive and oppressed masses from people who they trust? Well, it's not so much really a question of elections, not here and now, because, you know, we know whoever's going to be elected is going to be an imperialist tool at this point. But how do we get people beyond the electoral arena into the mass struggle? Recruiting is one thing. You recruit the 2s and 3s. Maybe I hope we can recruit more. But to bring people into struggle, if you just denounce the Social Democrats, and this is the same whether it's the SPD in Germany or the DSA, and say they're fascist and fuck off. You know, we don't want nothing to do with you. But appealing to their leaders is the best way. I mean, if you let's say you wanted to call a mobilization or a general strike, and you call on, or maybe the Trump is coming to town, you want to call a demonstration, you say, join us. Well, either they do or they don't. If they do, that's great, because we want, you know, this is a military question. We want the largest number of people with us in the struggle. And we want to fight in the struggle is where we can prove our superiority. But you appeal to, you appeal to their leadership as a way to get to the rank and file. If they reject you, that exposes them. If they unite with you, then you take it to the next step, and you have a bigger audience to work with, because you're together. Even when you're in an alliance, you can criticize. Of course you can. Why not? But also this raises the question, I think, which might be the subject of another class, is what is fascism? You know, because people say now it's common to say they're all fascists. They're all fascists. Like there's no difference between the repression that existed in Germany under the Weimar Republic and what happened under Hitler. There's a little bit of a difference between, you know, between police breaking up demonstrations and gas chambers and massacres and concentration camps and World War. You know, the people, the majority of the social democratic base was not for that. The majority of the democratic base is not for that. How do we win them and expose their leaders? And often, a united front tactic is the best way to do it. And so it's also a matter of relationship of forces. If they're much stronger than we are, if we invite a bourgeois Democratic congressperson or something to speak at a rally, are they going to bring more people? And they're better known than we are, and they bring more people to us. That's good for us. When we had a rally from Mumia at Madison Square Garden, we got denounced for having Mayor Dinkins, who was a black mayor of New York, who was bourgeois, you know, for speaking. But he was well known. He was willing to come out from Mumia and bring people who'd never heard of Mumia to come to that rally because it was Dinkins. That's a victory for us. And then that audience is open to us.
Hey, Jerry, go ahead.
I don't want to speak on the PSL question at all, but I wanted to speak to a couple of things and to kind of follow up a little bit on what Bill was saying. One is, I think one thing is in the upcoming period, and right now, there's clearly a lot of motion of groups trying to figure out how to grapple with the economic attack that's coming down so severely on our class. And this is going to, and I think we all view this is not going to go away. If anything, it's going to open up even more when the state of emergency is over, because the economic crisis will continue and there'll actually be more openings to get out in the street and fight it. I mean, one thing we've always done in our mass work is we always operate in united fronts. We're always looking to work with any group that wants to fight water shutoffs, that wants to fight foreclosures. But what we try to bring in, and even now we've been going on calls with all different groups, you know, right to, what do they call the right to the city? There's a group that's fighting DTE grouping. There's all these different groupings, and we've been going on their calls. But when we go in there, we also what we want to bring in to the broader movement, and what we contribute to it is an anti-capitalist perspective, and how to raise demands and push the struggle in a direction that challenges the system. And that's what we've always used transitional demands for. And I think there's going to be tremendous opening to do that in the coming period, and that we need to do it constantly. The other thing I want to do is comment on what Bill was saying more broadly on the question of the united front in a bigger political circumstance like what David was describing. I mean, there are periods of time when the social democrats are much stronger than the communists, and they're in a position to lead, to be in a leading position, and that's where the tactical approach of how communists react to them and deal with them becomes critical. But it's always from the point of view of not supporting them to support them. It's just supporting them from the point of view of viewing how we move the struggle forward in the communist direction. During the years, the period between the February and the October Revolution in the Soviet Union, there was what was called the July Days. Now here, the Bolsheviks were in opposition to the provisional government under Kerensky and the socialist revolutionaries. But when that government, when the Tsarist forces regrouped and tried to overthrow the provisional government, the Bolsheviks militarily went into this, to send their people to defend that government against the old fascist elements. And when Lenin and Trotsky and some of the leaders came to some of the rank and file came to Lenin and Trotsky and said, why are we doing this? Why are we defending these pigs who are putting you, I think maybe it was with the Kornilov days, it might have been in August, after the July days, when the leadership of the Bolsheviks have been jailed, and the rank and file came to the leaders. Why would we do this? We don't want to defend these fascists. But Lenin told them, we're defending them today so we can overthrow them tomorrow. And that's kind of a lesson. Another example more recently of United Front was in Greece, where in my view, the Communist Party basically took a social fascist line and lost a big opportunity, because in Greece a few years ago, pretty close to the closest I've seen to a revolutionary opportunity in an industrial country that I've seen, at least in many, many years. Because under severe austerity, the Syriza took power, and Syriza was a social democratic government. And at one point, there was a critical moment, but the Communist Party line was just to denounce Syriza as no different than the right-wing capitalist elements, the pro-austerity elements, and Syriza took power on an anti-austerity line. At one point, there was actually a referendum on austerity in Greece. And it was a critical moment in the struggle when the IMF and the World Bank was really putting the pressure on Greece. And the referendum was a referendum on austerity. And the form of the referendum was basically to defend Syriza at that moment. And the CP sat out the referendum. It told its people not to vote. And the referendum, and what they did by doing that is they isolated themselves from the masses who were in arms. They were ready. They wanted to fight austerity. Well, eventually what happened was then, under the pressure, Syriza sold out. And, the shit came down and austerity kind of won out in Greece for a period of time. And a lot of the CPers would say, well, you see, we did the right thing because we told people Syriza was going to sell out, and they sold out. But the problem was, before the crisis, the CP had about a 4 or 5% vote. And after the crisis, the CP had a 4 or 5% vote. Had it intervened, had it defended Syriza and found its way to this fight against austerity, it would have been in a position to pick up the pieces when Syriza collapsed. And they were right. Everyone knew Syriza would probably collapse because they were social democratic. And social democrats aren't in a position to stand up to finance capital. But because they isolated themselves, the struggle, now they look at themselves that they were right, but they ain't in power. And that's really what it's all about. The whole question is a question of power. And that's what we're serious about, making a revolution. But making a revolution means using tactics that don't isolate you from the struggle. And even if it means uniting with someone you can't stand for a moment, you unite with that person. So ultimately, you can overthrow them down the road and build the communist society, which is what we're all for.
Okay, thanks, Jerry. Anyone else have comments? Want to wrap it up, David? There are no more comments. Almost perfect timing.
Yeah, 2 hours is a good class. Thanks everybody for coming. And
Thank you, David.
Yeah, if you want that material, I'm going to send it to Sharon. If you want it, let me know.